Thanks for joining us with Lowitja Live. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're all on today. This is being shot on Ngunnawal and the Ngambri land, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. Extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us and everyone else for joining us. So we're here with Roianne West, who's a Kalkadoon Jacunda woman, and she's also the CEO of Katsanam. What does Katsanam stand for?
Thanks, Summer, for having me. Katsanam stands for the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, and we're the peak advocacy body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses nationally.
Fantastic. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your journey getting to Katsanam, but also with Lowitja?
Yeah, so my journey, I'd probably say, starts with my grandmother. So my grandmother's name was Ruby Tim. Her former names were Barton and also Rogers, and my grandfather was William Barton. My mother is Karen West. She was a Barton formerly, and my father is Lawrence West. So my grandmother was born on the banks of the Cloncurry River, and she lived life under the Aboriginal Protections Act for Queensland and was taken away from her mother when she was 13. My success I attribute to a lot of things, Summer, but I more recently realised that the grounding of being born and raised Kalkadoon in Cloncurry, between Cloncurry and Mount Isa for the first 20 years of my life, has given me a really solid cultural grounding from which all of my work now bounces off.
Fantastic. So when you're talking about your cultural grounding, how do you think that influences the work you do within it in the Aboriginal community-controlled health space?
Yeah, massively. So most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because of that upbringing, being raised in Cloncurry with my grandparents, lots of aunties, lots of uncles, lots of cousins, and granddad, I will be forever grateful for and mum and dad for making a deliberate and conscious decision to raise us Aboriginal and everything that come with that. So being raised around a lot of family and lots of stories. I remember going camping down at the Cloncurry River, like all of these stories that I thought every kid in Australia experienced, that I've only realised since becoming a lot more mature and doing Aboriginal research, that these were examples of Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing. And it was through my research journey that became a lot more explicit about what made me Aboriginal and different to non-Aboriginal people. So it was a real personal and a professional journey for me.
Fantastic. So you obviously went into the research space, but before that you were a nurse. How did you end up in nursing?
Yeah, so I started nursing. My dad had 3 sisters that were hospital-trained nurses, and my mother had an aunt who was one of the first Aboriginal graduates from the Mount Isa base hospital, and then a lot of my aunties were assistants in nursing back in the day at base hospitals. So it's very, sort of almost inevitable that we ended up working in Aboriginal health. And Mum had a vision. We were part of a Aboriginal nursing program whereby Deakin University delivered a program in Mount Isa. So quite a rare program, and then it was a community-based program, and not often do universities go to remote communities and establish programs, and that program was run between the Deakin University Institute of Koori Education and Ingelingi Health Service in Mount Isa, that sort of overseen the curriculum, and the program was about specifically about increasing Aboriginal nurses in the Mount Isa area, and myself, my twin sister, my brother and a cousin all trained and graduated together out of that program.
Wow, so you've got a whole family of nurses.
We're 4th generation, and I've got twin daughters that are doing nursing and midwifery at the moment.
Fantastic. So that just made me think about the fact, the old saying where you can't be what you can't see.
Yeah.
How important do you think it is to have role models like yourself and also your family in the health space?
Absolutely important. So, another aspect of my success I attribute to my mother and my grandmother. So my grandmother's worked tirelessly in Aboriginal affairs. My mother just recently retired after 45 years being an Aboriginal health worker on her country. So Mum takes her role in the community seriously, and she sees working at a grassroots level with our people and getting what she calls the real story, and that's something she sees as a great responsibility and something that she's passed on to all of us, and irrespective of where we work, what town, country, state or territory, that's something that we've inherited from our mother.
Fantastic. So thinking about research, how important is it for researchers to understand that you've got to work at that local community level?
Oh, it's critical. Otherwise, the research is redundant. It just becomes research that almost, well, it does more harm than good. So you're better off not doing the research unless you're doing it in the right way. And the right way also relates to the real story. It's what our communities are telling us that needs to be done. And unfortunately, that's a real paradigm shift for research in Australia and research internationally, because research is about knowledge creation. So non-Indigenous research doesn't recognise the Indigenous knowledge that's allowed us to be here for 60,000 years. And Indigenous research acknowledges, and Roianne referred to Aboriginal researchers as unveiling knowledge, not creating knowledge.
Yeah, fantastic. And how did you get into research?
By mistake. So I never actually thought I never thought I'd even have a degree somewhere. So when I was in year 12, I was 10 to 12, Mum and Dad always had a really strong work ethic. We always had to go to school, and when I went through school, completing year 12 was a massive achievement for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. So I was, this nursing program come to Mount Isa. It was Mum that actually had the vision about her 3 kids going into nursing, because of most of her life as a health worker, she was reporting to non-Indigenous nurses.
Right.
And that's what continues to drive us today, is our mother telling stories as a traditional owner and elder, and having to ask a non-Indigenous nurse who's a practice manager at our local Aboriginal medical service for permission to attend a funeral. Is the stuff that drives us to do the work that we do today.
Yeah. And what excites you about research? Because you fell into it, so obviously something excited you enough to keep you there.
Yeah, because I was fortunate enough to be a part of an NHMRC building Indigenous research capacity building grant at James Cook University. Prior to that, I had never, and if anything, was the complete opposite. So research is a very love-hate relationship. So I thought research, like most people, think it's a bit wanky. Not relevant for us, but because we went through as an Indigenous cohort and we got to be exposed to Iribinarigni's work, all of the Aboriginal methodologists, Karen Martin, so we were fortunate enough to have the way that we thought and the way that we were validated, whereas non-Indigenous methodologies and methods were almost the complete opposite, to the extent that we not only have to know the non-Indigenous research, we've also got to know that well enough to be able to critique it in order to be able to use Indigenous methodologies. So I learned a lot from that experience, but I learned that it was possible, and I also seen the benefit of Aboriginal research to Aboriginal communities as well.
What kind of benefit have you seen from the research?
I wouldn't be where I am today. Like, just the opportunities and the possibilities that it creates for Aboriginal researchers, but being in a position to be able to more directly respond to communities. So we're fortunate to be in a position where we don't have to go out and sell our research. We've got communities coming to us and saying, look, I like the way you've done that. Can you come and help us do this? Like, we're at the point where we can't contain the demand, because the way Indigenous research is done is the way Indigenous communities like it to be done.
We need more Indigenous researchers.
We need more Indigenous researchers.
Yeah, it's fantastic. What would you say to someone who's thinking about research in terms of encouraging them to become a researcher?
We have to absolutely do it. I still sometimes get saddened when we're talking about Indigenous health workforce that if you look at the statistics, about 80% of Aboriginal health professionals sit in the Cert 3. So in 2020, we're still looking at a Cert 3 and finishing year 12, whereas the non-Indigenous Australians are now moving on to having a majority of PhDs. And Indigenous research truly is a vehicle for us lifting our head and for our youth seeing that a bachelor is one step. Whereas now we're saying get through year 12 and then a bachelor's degree and then that's it. So we've got non-Indigenous researchers are moving on to masters, postgrad, PhD, and that's where leadership comes from, unfortunately, in Western systems, is with those qualifications. But the opportunity to be able to validate Indigenous knowledge, recognise the value of Indigenous knowledge, really can only come from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers.
So what are some of the barriers actually holding people back from maybe going on to a tertiary education?
It's because our gaze is low. So we don't have Indigenous research built into undergraduate programs. So even though our undergraduate health programs now say it's mandatory for research to be one of the program accreditation standards, we should be saying it's mandatory for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, because that's where we'd get Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander undergraduate students starting to see the possibilities, but also a very different face of research that they're exposed to in their undergraduate programs.
Yeah, absolutely. Which means we need more Aboriginal academics to be able to teach that appropriately too.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It really is a supply-demand issue, isn't it? Because that's one of the disadvantages. There's such a demand on you, and working out, you know, what's your bit like without, because it's such a complex area. If you aren't very clear about what's the bit that you're going to lead, is that it can become overwhelming, and then you don't actually feel like you're achieving anything, and you can almost become disillusioned with it. And you don't learn that early. So I've been in Aboriginal health for 25 years, and I'm only now at the point where, okay, my bit is around nursing and midwifery workforce. That's my bit around the whole close the gap. None of us can close the gap single-handedly. How do we have a much more systematic approach around who's leading which programs of research across the whole spectrum of Aboriginal healthcare?
Absolutely. And so you talked about some of the barriers to research, and you identified that having undergrads exposed to Indigenous research is a potential solution. But do you see any other potential solutions to addressing, obviously, the low bar?
I think role modelling, so exposing more of our mob that are researchers, senior researchers, also community-based research as well, and non-traditional pathways. So I went into a Bachelor Nursing having failed Maths, English and Science in Year 12. And then I went into a Master's by not through none of my journey has been what is a traditional pathway. And even going into a PhD, I had to enrol into a Master's and then upgrade to a PhD. And through strong mentorship, I think I fumbled my way through it, and I was halfway through a PhD before I realised, oh, now it's too late to pull out because you've done all your data. You've done all your data collection, and there was a bit of that stubbornness. But the transition across all elements of the pathway have to be so seamless. And at the moment, unfortunately, I think they're still a bit clunky. Universities have different entry points. They don't recognise work that's been done previously to enrolment. So there's still some system things that need to be changed in order to facilitate a much more seamless progression into research pathways or PhD.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you want to add about research or Lowitja?
Yeah, so just one of the final questions that was on my list, Summer, is how did I become involved in research? And it's funny in that I'm sitting here today doing an interview for Lowitja. How I become exposed to Lowitja was through Auntie Pat Anderson. And I was presenting at a Katsanam conference where Janine Mohammed was her first conference as CEO. So I went along and Janine asked me to present, and Auntie Pat was presenting after me or before me, so she was watching me talk on my PhD, which developed a model of excellence for increasing Indigenous nurses nationally. And she had come up and introduced herself. It's the first time I'd met her, and she connected me with the then CEO. And then from then, Lowitja come and visited me in Townsville. No one comes to Townsville very often from Canberra. Come up to visit me, and then from then Romley started, and I was being invited to participate in some of the workforce, different programs of research. And since then, I've been quite heavily involved. It's a privilege to be on the Research Advisory Committee, a piece of work where we've redesigned and really put a lot of thought into what's our difference to NHMRC and ARC, what's our point of difference. So we don't want to do the same because we can't establish what our difference is, and it was really about Indigenous knowledge and grassroots responsiveness, and that was a privilege to be able to influence around those research programs and the different criteria. So now I sit in Janine's old job, and Janine's the CEO of Lowitja. So it was sort of like, oh, this was meant to be, wasn't it? So
it's a small world in the Aboriginal world.
It's a very small world, but yeah, I'm now where Janine was. Janine is now over where I'd started with Lowitja. So yeah, it's lovely. You're meant to be when you start to, those relationships are consolidated across the years and at different times.
That's how our mob gets stuff done, isn't it? Relationships.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And that's a challenge when you've got a lot of non-Indigenous systems who sometimes see that relationality as conflicts of interest, when often that relationality is actually a benefit but it's a very Western way to look at it as a perceived or a potential conflict of interest.
Absolutely. We don't get stuff done without relationships. So.
No, but because we're trying to navigate non-Indigenous systems, we don't often talk about that at the fear of that being perceived as something else.
Absolutely. So one other question, just thinking about it, do you have any inspiring quotes that you think about from time to time?
Yeah, this was an interesting question. Probably we've got different quotes at different points in my career. I know when I was doing my PhD, it was Winston Churchill. If you're going through hell, don't stop. So that was my PhD. Yep. But the one that resonates and keeps coming up at different points in my journey is the Marianne Williamson one that often gets attributed to Nelson Mandela, is our greatest fear. Our greatest fear is that we're powerful beyond measure, and who are we not to? And that really spoke to me as an Aboriginal woman coming from a remote community, because it almost, in some instances, the more educated or the more successful or more influential you got, it was like you become less Aboriginal because you're becoming more. So that quote spoke to me, because there was times in my career where I acted less than in order for that to happen. So that quote is really powerful, because it reminds you to be the best of who you are and not to shrink because other people need to see that to rise up to, rather than shrink back.
That is a fantastic note to end on. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.